Hello chess fans, this is Rick from Chess to Impress. Only 43 days till the World Championship match between Carlsen and Caruana will start in November in London. That's just over 6 weeks. On Chess to Impress we continue the build up to this great match, which will be the 47th event in the history of the official and undisputed World Championship by looking at the first 46 events. We have arrived in 1963. The world champion is still Mikhail Botvinnik, and in that year he defended his title against Tigran Petrosian. Petrosian was not a new kid on the block, he had been in the candidates tournaments since 1953. And we have to pick out one moment of the candidates tournament in 1956 in Amsterdam, where Petrosian played as well. In the second round he got this position against David Bronstein. Petrosian was white, Bronstein was black, and white has a dominating position. He's winning here. He just played queen a3 to d6, infiltrating into black's position. Bronstein played knight f5, and here queen c7 is the best move. But what did Petrosian play? He played knight g5, completely overlooking that his queen was attacked by black's last move. Bronstein took the queen and Petrosian resigned. He had lost the first game as well. What a way to start the candidates tournament. He still finished in joint third place in 1956. Let's move back to 1962. Bobby Fischer won the interzonal tournament in Stockholm ahead of Petrosian. This is the table of that interzonal tournament. Fischer 1.5 points ahead of Geller and Petrosian, and 3.5 points ahead of Korchnoi and Philip. And Bobby was only 18 at the time. On they went to the candidates tournament, and Petrosian won that candidates tournament. And this is the table of that candidates tournament held on the island of Curacao. 5 players from the Soviet Union, 2 Americans and a player from Czechoslovakia, and Petrosian came out on top. Misha Tal was suffering from ill health and was taken into hospital during the tournament. And as you can see, Fischer, who had won the interzonal, only was able to finish in 4th place. There was some controversy as Petrosian, Keres and Geller drew all 12 games against each other. And Viktor Korchnoi later said the 3 players had privately agreed that they would draw all their games with each other to save energy for the games against the other players. And poor Paul Keres finished 2nd for the 4th time in the candidates tournament. And Tal said, "Only once did I see Keres upset at the finish of Curacao." The theory of probability played a cruel trick on him. So Tigran Petrosian had qualified for the World Championship match against world champion Botvinnik. What kind of player was Petrosian? Well, let's look at what Grandmaster Keen wrote about him. Petrosian's style makes his games most difficult to analyze of all the world champions. Like Tal, he had a very quick side of the board and could calculate tactical variations at incredible speed. Whereas Tal used this facility to demolish his opponents, Petrosian allied this tactical ability to his feeling of balance and sense of danger. And Petrosian went on to beat Botvinnik, who said after the match, "It was really hard to play Tigran. The thing is that he had a somewhat different understanding of positional play. He went deeper into it than usual, and myself, a universal player, did not completely understand Tigran's way and depth of judgment, although I was judging all positions well," said the dethroned world champion. Here's a picture of the match. On the left, world champion Botvinnik, on the right, the challenger Tigran Petrosian. In this video we're going to look at game 5 from the match. Let's get into it. It is the 1st of April 1963, the score is 2.5, 1.5 in favor of world champion Botvinnik, who won the first game. White is Petrosian, black is Botvinnik, and Petrosian opened with c4, g6 from the world champion, d4, knight f6, knight c3 and d5. Botvinnik plays the Grunfeld Indian defense, named after Ernst Grunfeld from Austria, who introduced this opening into international play at Vienna in 1922, where in his first game with the defense he defeated future world champion Alexander Aljochin. Knight f3 from Petrosian, bishop g7, and here many moves are possible. Bishop g5 is popular, so is c takes d5, and so is queen b3. They're the three most popular options, but Petrosian plays e3, the fourth most popular move, which is still played nowadays by top grandmasters like Karjakin, Aronyan and Ivanchuk. Botvinnik castled, bishop e2 and d takes c4. Now that this bishop has played, black takes on c4 to force white to play with the bishop again and lose the tempo this way. Petrosian took, c5, typical Grunfeld move, and d5. Now black has to counter white in the center, otherwise white will castle and play e4, controlling the center with a nice advantage for white, as explained by Grandmaster Akobian. e6, and Petrosian took, decides to give up his castling rights to create a weakness in black's position. Botvinnik took on d1, and you can of course take with the knight, but it makes more sense to take with the king, as Petrosian did. We are in an endgame already, so king's safety is not as important. The king belongs in the center in an endgame. Bishop takes, and now white creates that weakness in black's camp. The e-pawn is weak. King e2, knight c6. Despite that weakness on e6, black is perfectly fine here. It's easy to defend that weakness. Rook d1 on the open file, countering on the open file, and a pair of rooks was swapped. And now knight g5. Petrosian decides not to develop his queen side yet. First he is attacking the e-pawn, and there's only one way to defend it. You can't play the e-pawn up, because then there is knight e6 with a fork, winning the c-pawn. So after knight g5, Botvinnik defended with the rook, defending the pawn. Knight ge4, and a pair of knights was swapped. More exchanges. b6, protecting the c5 pawn, and it's a completely equal position. But Petrosian has an idea. He wants to create a second weakness. This is a very instructive game. He plays rook b1, knight b4, attacking the pawn on a2, and now many players would decide to solve that problem by just playing a3, kicking the knight back, but not Petrosian. He plays bishop d2 instead, and taking on a2 is now not good for black because of rook a1, knight back, bishop takes, c takes, and white takes on a7. Black can take on b2, but rook b7 is good. Bishop c3 and rook takes b6 with a nice advantage for white. Black now has got two weak pawns. So after bishop d2, it's not good to take on a2, and Botvinnik recognized that, and he played knight back to d5. a4 from Petrosian. Rook c8, and now b3. Now the white rook can play. The pawn is no longer attacked on b2, and that beautiful Grunfeld bishop on g7 is hitting fresh air all along the diagonal. Bishop f8, rook c1, and here rook c7 is a good move, making sure the rook is protected there. That would have stopped white's next move. But after rook c1, Botvinnik played bishop e7. And now Petrosian could play b4, because you cannot take that pawn, because your rook is unprotected. And taking with the knight is not good either, for the same reason. Bishop takes, c takes, and the rook is unprotected. So after b4, Botvinnik played c4. And now look at this move, very instructive. Petrosian plays b5. And now the pawn on c4 is weak. Petrosian prevents Botvinnik to play b5 himself to support the pawn. Now the pawn is left by itself without support from other pawns. Very nice move, b5. So black now has two isolated pawns, but still his position is very solid. His pieces are very good. it's not easy to make progress for white. Botvinnik played king f7, bishop c3, improving the bishop, bishop a3 hitting the rook, rook c2, and Botvinnik decided to take on c3. Rook takes, bishop b4, rook step back, and king e7. And how to continue now for white? He's better, but how to make progress? Petrosian played knight d2, and if you take that knight, then king takes, king d6, king c3, king c5, and rook d2. White has the open d file, and he will play rook d4 and take on c4. So taking the knight is not good. But what to do? This pawn is now hanging, attacked twice and only defended once, and you cannot defend it again. So the only way to not lose it is to play that pawn up, c3, but it gets more vulnerable there. The knight goes back to e4, attacking the pawn. Bishop a5, you have to keep the pawn protected. King d3, attacking it for a third time. Rook d8 check, king c4, and if you go and play another check, then the king goes to b3, and white will win the c-pawn, which is now attacked 3 times. So after king c4, Botvinnik played rook d1. Black goes for counterplay against white's kingside pawns. Petrosian took the pawn, and here analysis afterwards showed that here Botvinnik really should have gone into the rook endgame with bishop takes c3 and king takes c3. This was probably his best chance, but also then white has good winning chances with his extra pawn. Botvinnik decided against that. He did not take the knight, he played rook h1, attacking the pawn on h2. The knight went back to e4 again. Rook takes, and king d4. Now, taking on g2 is not good, because then the rook comes into c7 with check. King d8 and rook takes h7, which is a very good endgame for white. So after king d4, Botvinnik played king d7 to make sure the white rook does not infiltrate. g3, making sure that g-pawn is not lost, and bishop b4. And now look what Petrosian is doing. He's marching into black's position with his king. King e5. Black gave a check. King f6. Another check. And king g7. Wonderful, attacking black's weak pawns on the king side. Marching his king all the way into black's camp. e5 to be able to activate the king to e6. Very nice move, rook c6, cutting off the king. It cannot go to e6 now. Rook back to h1, king f7, rook swings over to a1, attacking the pawns there, and rook e6, now threatening to take the bishop. So you have to play the bishop, bishop d8, and rook d6 check. Now you have to be careful, you cannot go to c7 because of king e8. And what that move does, it's trapping the bishop. The bishop has no squares. No squares to go to. For a second it looks like the bishop can go to g5, because if you take, then the rook is unprotected. But there's a simple solution to that. Rook c6 check on a protected square, king b8, and then you take the bishop. So after rook d6 check you cannot go to c7. Botvinnik saw that and went to c8. And now king e8, again threatening to take the bishop. And in this game Petrosian is using his king as an attacking piece, and that is some king there on e8 on the opponent's king's starting square. Bishop c7, rook c6, pitting the bishop, and if you now take on a4, that's a big blunder, because white is going to win that bishop on c7 with knight c3 with tempo on the rook, and the next move is to go to d5, and then this bishop will fall. So after rook c6 you cannot take on a4, and Botvinnik played rook d1 to take the knight maneuver to d5 out of the position. But Petrosian goes the other way, knight g5, going after the h7 pawn now. Black gave a check, king f7, another check, and king g8. And what did Botvinnik do here? He resigned the game. He's going to lose both the g and h pawns. Let's have a look how that will work. You cannot keep checking the king, because after this check, white just takes the pawn. What you can do is play h6, attacking the knight. But then there is knight e6. And if you then play g5, then white can play g4, king b7, and then the quickest way to win is just take off all the pieces and win the king and pawn endgame. Rook takes, knight takes, king takes, and king g7. And white is collecting the pawns and wins the king and pawn endgame. Another variation, let's go back after king g8 where Botvinnik resigned. We played h6, knight e6, you can also play h5. And now the same thing works going into the king and pawn endgame, but we have to be careful. You can take on c7 with check, rook takes, knight takes, king takes, but now there is only one winning move, and that is f4. White has to be very careful, because if you play king g7, then it's actually black who wins this game of chess. With g5, the white king is too far away. King g6, but h4, and there's nothing you can do against a black pawn going through to queen. So in this position, f4 is the only move that wins. And if from the final position black plays h5, then the easiest way is just to take off the g6 pawn. And white wins. So after king g8, Botvinnik resigned, and the score now after 5 games was 2.5, 2.5. And as you can see from this table, Petrosian went on to win the match. He won 4 more games, only lost 1 more, and won after 22 games by 12.5, 9.5. And Tigran Petrosian was the 9th official and undisputed world champion. The right to a rematch that Botvinnik had used against Smyslov and against Stahl had been taken out of the regulations, so there was no rematch, and Botvinnik decided to retire from the World Championship. The last time a non-Soviet Union player was involved in a match for the World Championship was in 1948, and it didn't take long for another child of the Soviet Union chess school raised his head. 3 years later it was Boris Spassky who qualified for the World Championship match, and that's what the next video is about. Hope you liked this video on the Botvinnik-Petrosian match. If you did, please give the video a thumbs up, please subscribe to the Chess to Impress channel, and please leave a comment. I will read them all and I will make sure I will reply. If you liked the video, if you liked the series, it would be great if you could share it on social media by clicking the share button on YouTube. The link to the series is here, and this is Rick for Chess to Impress. Thank you for watching.